Welcome to New Harmony Station, the galaxy's most prestigious diplomatic venue, where species from across the known universe gather to discuss very important things like trade routes, territorial disputes, and who gets to use the good parking spaces near the station's core. Think of it as the United Nations, but with more tentacles and significantly worse coffee. The Galactic Peace Summit was in full swing, which meant approximately 300 alien dignitaries were standing around in fancy clothes making small talk and pretending they weren't mentally calculating how to conquer each other's homeworlds. The main conference hall buzzed with the gentle hum of universal translators working overtime to convert phrases like, "Your species smells like rotting fruit," into diplomatically acceptable terms like, "We find your cultural aromatics intriguing." In the center of this carefully orchestrated chaos stood Ambassador Jake Morrison, humanity's finest diplomatic representative, which really says something about the state of human diplomatic training. Jake was a man who genuinely believed that a firm handshake and a winning smile could solve any interstellar crisis, including the ongoing Zephyrian Moldovac conflict that had been raging for approximately 6 centuries. He had the kind of confidence that only comes from either supreme competence or complete ignorance of reality, and anyone who had met Jake could tell you which category he belonged in. "So," Jake was saying to a towering crystalline being from the Theta sector, "I was thinking we could really hash out this whole resource allocation thing over drinks. Do you folks drink? I mean, I assume you absorb nutrients somehow, right?" He gestured enthusiastically with his champagne flute, nearly splashing a passing diplomat from the Rigel system. "I brought some Earth bourbon, pure Kentucky stuff. It'll either kill you or make us best friends." The crystalline diplomat's internal light flickered in what their species considered polite confusion, while their translator worked frantically to make sense of Jake's casual approach to intergalactic relations. Meanwhile, lurking in the shadows near the observation deck, Vex Grimtail was having a much better day. At least, he thought he was. Vex was what you might call a professional problem solver, if the problems were living beings, and the solutions involved high-energy plasma weapons. Standing roughly 7 feet tall, with mottled gray skin and enough natural armor plating to stop a small meteorite, he was the Sithrak Empire's go-to guy when they needed someone to stop breathing in a particularly permanent way. Today's contract was almost insultingly simple: eliminate the human diplomat during the Peace Summit. The Sithraks had some very strong opinions about humanity's recent expansion into what they considered their rightful territory, and they figured the best way to express those opinions was through the ancient art of strategic assassination. Vex had been told this would be easy money, a milk run, practically a vacation compared to his usual targets. After all, what could one soft, pink, diplomatically minded human possibly do against a trained Sithrak killer? Humans were notorious throughout the galaxy for being talkers, not fighters. They were the species that tried to solve problems with conversation and compromise, the ones who brought lawyers to gunfights, and somehow expected to win through the power of properly filed paperwork. Vex checked his plasma rifle one more time and allowed himself a small, predatory smile. This was going to be the easiest payday of his career. Vex began his approach through the crowd, moving with the practiced stealth of someone who had turned murder into an art form. Well, more like finger painting than the Mona Lisa, but you get the idea. He slipped between clusters of chattering diplomats, his natural camouflage allowing him to blend seamlessly with the shadows cast by the station's elaborate architectural features. New Harmony Station really had gone overboard with the whole inspiring peace through impressive interior design concept. As he moved, Vex couldn't help but marvel at how pathetically easy this was going to be. Humans, he mused, were practically a galactic joke. Sure, they had managed to stumble their way into space travel and somehow convinced other species to take them seriously enough to invite them to peace summits, but everyone knew the truth. They were soft, weak, overly emotional creatures who cried at sad movies and apologized for things that weren't their fault. They were the species that had somehow managed to weaponize guilt and turned passive aggression into a diplomatic strategy. The intelligence reports on humanity were consistent across every major empire. They were talkers, not fighters. They solved conflicts through negotiation, mediation, and strongly worded letters. Their military was apparently more concerned with humanitarian aid than actual warfare. They were the galactic equivalent of that one friend who brings a salad to a barbecue and then spends the whole time explaining why everyone should really consider going vegetarian. Vex paused behind a decorative pillar shaped like some kind of flowering plant from the Andorian home system, watching Ambassador Morrison continue his charm offensive on the poor crystalline diplomat. The human was now attempting to explain the concept of small talk, while somehow making it sound like a revolutionary diplomatic technique. You see, Jake was saying, waving his hands expansively, it's not about the weather at all. Well, it is about the weather, but it's really about establishing common ground. Everyone has opinions about weather, right? Even you crystal folks must have some kind of atmospheric preferences. The crystalline being's light was now flickering in what could only be described as polite panic. Perfect. The target was completely distracted, surrounded by witnesses who would be too shocked to react quickly, and positioned exactly where Vex needed him to be. The assassin raised his plasma rifle, feeling the familiar weight of the weapon in his hands. The scope's targeting system quickly locked onto Ambassador Morrison's head, and Vex's finger moved to the trigger. This was it. One shot, one kill, one very satisfied client, and one very wealthy Vex. He began applying pressure to the trigger, already mentally spending his fee on that nice little retirement cave he'd been eyeing on Proxima 7th. Just a few more pounds of pressure and the galaxy's most annoying diplomat would become the galaxy's most former diplomat. And that's when Vex noticed her. Leaning against a support pillar about 20 feet away, looking for all the world like she was waiting for a particularly boring lecture to end, was a human woman in what appeared to be standard security attire. She was maybe 5'6", with short brown hair, and the kind of unremarkable features that would make her invisible in any crowd. She was holding a steaming cup of what looked like coffee, and she seemed to be staring off into space with the expression of someone mentally making a grocery list. Vex almost dismissed her entirely. Almost. After all, what kind of threat could one bored-looking human female possibly pose to a trained Sithrak assassin? She probably couldn't hurt a fly if the fly was already dead and nailed to a table. But something about her casual stance nagged at him. Professional paranoia, maybe, or just the natural caution that had kept him alive through 17 successful contracts. He shifted his scope slightly to get a better look at her, and that's when everything went sideways. The woman's eyes, which had been lazily scanning the crowd, suddenly locked directly onto his position. Not approximately his position, not the general area where he might be hiding, but exactly where his scope was pointed. Her gaze was so precise that Vex actually checked behind himself to see if she was looking at someone else. She wasn't. For a moment, neither of them moved. Vex found himself staring down his scope into the most unsettling pair of brown eyes he had ever encountered. They weren't angry or threatening or even particularly interested. They were just aware. Profoundly, completely, terrifyingly aware. It was like being spotted by a predator that was politely deciding whether or not you were worth the effort of killing. The woman took a slow sip of her coffee, never breaking eye contact. Then, without changing her relaxed posture even slightly, she raised one eyebrow in what could only be interpreted as a question. A very simple question. Really? You want to try this? Vex's hands began to sweat inside his gloves. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. The human was supposed to be oblivious, soft, vulnerable. She was supposed to be focusing on diplomatic small talk and proper canapé etiquette, not casually spotting trained assassins from across a crowded room like she was picking out fruit at a market. The woman shifted her weight slightly, still maintaining that same bored expression, still holding her coffee like this was all perfectly normal. But something about the movement made every instinct Vex had developed over his long and violent career start screaming at him to run. Not walk away casually, not abort the mission with dignity intact, but run, like his tail was on fire and his life depended on it. Which he was beginning to suspect it might. She took another sip of coffee and glanced at her watch with the air of someone wondering how much longer she had to endure this tedious social function. The gesture was so mundane, so perfectly ordinary, that it somehow made everything infinitely more terrifying. This woman wasn't treating him like a threat to be neutralized or an enemy to be defeated. She was treating him like a minor inconvenience that she might or might not bother to address, depending on how her day was going. Vex found himself lowering his rifle without consciously deciding to do so. His target acquisition had gone from locked and loaded to maybe I should reconsider my career choices in about 30 seconds flat. Ambassador Morrison, blissfully unaware that his life had just been saved by a woman who looked like she was debating whether to have another cup of coffee, continued his enthusiastic explanation of human small-talk methodology to his increasingly bewildered alien audience. The woman looked back at Vex one more time, and this time her expression was perfectly clear. "Your move, buddy. Choose wisely." That's when Vex heard the whispers. It started with a Regalian trade delegate who had been laughing at some joke about tariff regulations. The laughter died mid-chuckle as the delegate's three eyes focused on the woman with the coffee. The Regalian's skin immediately shifted from its normal pale blue to a sickly green color that, in their species, indicated either severe nausea or absolute terror. "Is that," the Regalian whispered to his companion, "is that Captain Rosa Valdez?" The name hit the crowd like electromagnetic pulse through a computer system. Conversations didn't just stop, they crashed and burned. Altarian Diplomat actually dropped his drink, and those people had prehensile tongues, specifically evolved to prevent that kind of social embarrassment. A group of Zephyrian military attachés who had been loudly discussing their species' superiority in ground combat suddenly found urgent reasons to examine their shoes. Vex felt his heart skip a beat, both of them. He'd heard that name before, whispered in the darker corners of mercenary bars and spoken with the kind of reverence usually reserved for natural disasters and tax audits. Rosa Tank Valdez, the Rosa Valdez, the human who had somehow become a living legend in military circles across half the galaxy, despite belonging to a species that most civilizations had written off as diplomatically minded pushovers. More whispers rippled through the crowd as words spread. The stories started flowing like water through a broken dam, each tale more outrageous than the last, and yet Vex knew that in military legend, the outrageous stories were usually the ones that turned out to be true. "She held the line at Proxima Station," someone was saying. "Entire Krellian assault battalion, and she held them off for 6 hours with nothing but a pulse rifle and attitude." "I heard she once stared down a Void Runner dreadnought captain until he surrendered," added another voice. "Didn't fire a shot. Just looked at him through the view screen until he decided he had somewhere else to be." A Scythy elderly cetacean ambassador whose species was known for their photographic memory and absolute accuracy in military history spoke up in his deep, resonant voice. "I was there during the siege of Kepler 442. The orbital defense platforms had fallen, the colonial government was in full retreat, and 3 Sithrak heavy cruisers were moving in for planetary bombardment." His massive eyes focused on Rosa with something approaching religious awe. "Captain Valdez held that system with a single frigate and what she called aggressive negotiations. Bux's blood, which was already running cold, managed to find a few more degrees to drop. He was Sithrak himself. He knew that story. Every Sithrak military academy taught it as an example of how quickly tactical superiority could turn into strategic disaster when humans were involved. What they didn't teach was that it had been one human who had somehow convinced 3 heavy cruisers to retreat by using psychological warfare techniques that were still classified at the highest levels of Sithrak military intelligence. "Didn't she take out an entire pirate fleet near the Vega system?" asked a young Andromedan diplomat who was clearly too junior to know when to stop talking. 17 ships, confirmed the cetacean. "The pirates made the mistake of threatening a civilian transport. Captain Valdez was escorting a humanitarian aid convoy at the time. She gave them one warning. And when they didn't listen?" The cetacean's expression grew solemn. "They listened very quickly after that. The survivors are still in therapy." Vex was beginning to understand that his simple assassination contract had just become significantly more complicated. The woman casually sipping coffee 20 feet away wasn't just some random security guard. She was a walking natural disaster, with a personnel file that probably required its own security clearance just to read. The crowd was now giving Rosa a wide berth, not out of rudeness but out of the kind of respectful fear normally reserved for active volcanoes and unstable quantum reactors. Even species that had never heard of humans before seemed to pick up on the universal body language of, "That person could probably kill everyone in this room and still have time for lunch." A mollusk delegate, whose species was famous for their unflappable nature, was visibly sweating through his environmental suit. "I heard she once ended a 3-way planetary war by showing up and asking everyone to please keep it down because she was trying to read." "The Titan Rebellion," nodded another voice. "She didn't even have official authority to intervene. She was on vacation." Rosa herself seemed completely oblivious to the growing legend being recounted around her. She checked her watch again, took another sip of coffee, and looked mildly annoyed at something, possibly the fact that the coffee was getting cold. She gave no indication that she was aware of being the subject of increasingly nervous conversation among some of the galaxy's most powerful military and political figures. But Vex knew better now. She was aware of everything. The growing whispers, the nervous glances, his position behind the decorative plant, probably what he'd had for breakfast and how many rounds were left in his rifle. Women like Rosa Valdez didn't survive the kind of career that generated these stories by missing details. Ambassador Morrison, meanwhile, had moved on to explaining the concept of weather talk to a group of beings from a planet that didn't have weather. blissfully unaware that his bodyguard was currently causing a minor diplomatic incident simply by existing in the same room as people who knew her reputation. Vex realized he was facing a choice. He could complete his mission and try to assassinate a human diplomat who was under the protection of a woman who had apparently made several galactic militaries reconsider their expansion plans, or he could accept that some contracts were beyond even his considerable skills and find a new line of work. The smart money was definitely on option 2. Vex began his retreat with all the dignity and professionalism of a seasoned assassin who had suddenly realized he was attempting to hunt a hurricane with a fly swatter. He carefully backed away from his position, keeping low, using every technique his instructors had drilled into him during his years of training in the ancient Sithrak art of strategic withdrawal under fire. The plan was simple. Blend into the crowd, make his way to one of the service exits, and disappear into the station's maintenance levels, where he could catch a transport off this diplomatic nightmare and find a nice, safe career. Maybe accounting. Nobody ever shot at accountants. Well, not very often. He made it approximately 15 feet before he noticed Rosa was no longer leaning against her pillar. This was concerning for several reasons, not least of which was that he hadn't seen her move. One moment she'd been there, looking bored and drinking coffee, and the next moment she was just elsewhere. Vex spun around, scanning the crowd with the frantic energy of someone who had just realized they were playing hide-and-seek with a professional hide-and-seek champion who made a living out of winning. He spotted her near the refreshment table, examining a tray of what appeared to be Andromedan hors d'oeuvres with the critical attention of a food critic. She was still holding her coffee, still looking mildly disinterested in everything around her, but she was now positioned directly between Vex and his planned exit route. This could have been a coincidence, except Vex had stopped believing in coincidences around the time he'd learned that Rosa Valdez had once ended a civil war by accidentally walking into the wrong building. No problem. He was a professional. He could adapt. There were other exits. Vex changed direction, moving toward a secondary exit that led to the station's commercial district. He kept to the edges of the crowd, using his natural camouflage abilities to blend with the shadows cast by the elaborate decorative columns. His movements were smooth, practiced, nearly invisible. When he looked up again, Rosa was standing next to a decorative fountain, apparently fascinated by the way the water fell in the station's artificial gravity. She was about 30 feet away, still looking like she was attending the galaxy's most boring social function, still nursing the same cup of coffee. The fountain was, coincidentally, positioned with a perfect line of sight to the exit Vex had been approaching. Okay, this was getting weird. Third exit. There was a maintenance access port near the observation deck that most people didn't know about. Vex had done his homework on this station, studied the blueprints, memorized every possible escape route. He began moving again, this time taking a deliberately circuitous path that would make him impossible to track. 5 minutes later, he found Rosa examining a potted plant that some decorator had thought would add a touch of natural beauty to the station's metal corridors. She seemed genuinely interested in the plant's unusual purple leaves, holding her coffee in one hand and gently touching a leaf with the other, like she was considering whether it would look good in her apartment. The plant happened to be positioned exactly where someone would need to pass to reach the maintenance access. By now, other people were starting to notice the pattern. Conversations were becoming increasingly strained as diplomats and their security details began to realize that something resembling a chase was happening in their midst, except it was the strangest chase in recorded galactic history. Usually, chases involved running, shouting, weapons fire, and at least a moderate amount of property damage. This chase involved a lot of casual walking, mild sightseeing, and what appeared to be a coffee-tasting tour. Vex was beginning to sweat profusely, which was problematic because Sithraks only sweated when they were either extremely hot or convinced they were about to die. The climate control on New Harmony Station was excellent. He tried a fourth exit. Rosa was there first, this time admiring a piece of abstract sculpture that looked like someone had dropped a quantum computer into a blender. She nodded approvingly at the artwork's bold use of twisted metal and crystalline structures, as if she was genuinely enjoying this impromptu cultural tour of the station's decorative features. Fifth exit. Rosa was examining the nutritional information display at a food vendor's cart, apparently comparing the caloric content of different alien snack foods. She looked mildly disappointed by the sodium levels in Regelian protein bars. Next exit. Rosa was reading a public information display about the station's recycling program with the attention of someone who was genuinely concerned about environmental sustainability in space habitats. By the seventh exit, Vex was no longer even pretending this was a professional withdrawal. He was simply fleeing in blind panic while a human woman who appeared to be conducting a leisurely tour of the station somehow managed to be everywhere he needed to go before he got there. It was like being chased by a very polite, very caffeinated ghost who had an unusual interest in interior decorating. The diplomatic crowd was now actively getting out of the way, creating clear sightlines between Rosa and wherever Vex happened to be hiding at any given moment. Even the most oblivious species had figured out that some kind of predator-prey situation was unfolding, and nobody wanted to accidentally end up as collateral damage in whatever this was. Rosa, for her part, continued to look like she was having a perfectly normal day. She finished her coffee, disposed of the cup in an appropriate recycling receptacle, because even during psychological warfare, proper waste management was important, and began what could only be described as the galaxy's most terrifying casual stroll. She wasn't following Vex, exactly. She was just happening to be wherever he was going, whenever he got there. She was like a very patient, very thorough tour guide who was making sure he got to see every important feature of New Harmony Station, whether he wanted to or not. Vex tried hiding in a maintenance closet. When he peeked out 15 minutes later, Rosa was standing in the corridor outside, apparently reading safety instructions posted on the wall, with the dedication of someone preparing for a very important exam on emergency procedures. He tried hiding in a different maintenance closet. Rosa was in the next corridor over, seemingly absorbed in comparing the architectural styles of different sections of the station. By the time Vex had tried hiding in a third maintenance closet, he was beginning to suspect that Rosa had somehow gained access to the station's internal sensor network and was tracking him with the kind of technological advantage that made this whole situation less like a chase and more like a very elaborate, very humiliating science experiment. End of poem. This recording has been edited for linguistic. The worst part was that she never looked directly at him. She never acknowledged his presence, never made any threatening gestures, never did anything that could be interpreted as aggressive behavior. She was just there. Always there. Wherever he went, whatever he tried, Rosa Valdez was nearby, looking mildly interested in her surroundings and completely unthreatened by anything happening around her. It was the most psychologically devastating pursuit in Vex's professional experience, and he once had a bounty hunter track him across 3 star systems, using nothing but a grudge and an unhealthy obsession with proper invoice documentation. The breaking point came when Vex found himself crouched behind a decorative waterfall in the station's central atrium, hyperventilating into his hands and questioning every life choice that had led him to this moment. He was a professional assassin, for crying out loud. He had taken down warlords, corporate executives, and at least 3 different species of apex predators that most people only saw in nightmares. He should not be hiding behind artificial landscaping from a woman who looked like she worked part-time at a library. That's when he heard the footsteps. Slow, measured, completely unhurried footsteps that seemed to echo through the atrium with the inevitability of a cosmic countdown timer. Vex peered around the edge of the waterfall and saw Rosa approaching, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, she was looking directly at him. She had somehow acquired another cup of coffee. Where she had gotten it, when she had gotten it, and how she had managed to obtain hot beverages while conducting what amounted to psychological warfare remained mysteries that Vex's rapidly fragmenting sanity could not process. Rosa stopped about 10 feet away from his hiding spot and took a sip of her coffee. Then she spoke for the first time, and her voice was exactly as terrifying as everything else about her, completely, utterly normal. "You know," she said conversationally, "I really appreciate the tour. I've been working security for Ambassador Morrison for 3 months now, and I never really had time to explore the station properly. That sculpture near the 7th exit was particularly interesting, very avant-garde, really makes you think about the relationship between chaos and structure in post-industrial galactic society." Vex made a sound that was part whimper, part existential crisis. "I'm also impressed by your persistence," Rosa continued, apparently addressing her remarks to the decorative waterfall in general rather than the 7-foot-tall alien assassin crouched behind it. "Most people would have given up after the 3rd exit. The fact that you made it all the way to 7 shows real dedication to your craft. I respect that in a professional." That did it. Whatever was left of Vex's composure, dignity, and career prospects completely evaporated. He stood up, threw his plasma rifle on the ground with a clatter that echoed through the atrium, and raised all 4 of his hands in the universal gesture of surrender. "I yield," he announced, his voice cracking like an adolescent Sithrak going through puberty. "I surrender. I give up. I quit. I'm done. I'm retiring. I'm becoming an accountant. Please just make it stop." Rosa looked mildly surprised, as if she had just noticed him for the first time. "Oh, hello there. I didn't see you back there. Nice camouflage work, by the way, very professional. Vex stared at her in complete bewilderment. You've been following me for the last 2 hours. Following you? Rosa looked genuinely confused. I've been taking a break. Ambassador Morrison is explaining human social customs to the cetacean delegation, and that's going to take a while. They have 17 different words for awkward silence, and he's determined to demonstrate all of them. I figured I'd use the time to explore a bit. She gestured around the atrium with her coffee cup. This is actually a very nicely designed station, great architecture, excellent use of space. But you were at every exit, every single one. Rosa nodded thoughtfully. Well, yes, I was doing a security sweep, standard protocol when protecting a high-value target in an unfamiliar environment. I like to know where all the exits are, check the sight lines, identify potential sniper nests. She paused and looked at him more carefully. Speaking of which, were you planning to use that rifle for something specific? Because I have to tell you, the decorative plant you were hiding behind earlier doesn't provide nearly enough cover for effective long-range targeting. Also, you left the safety on. Vex looked down at his discarded weapon and realized that indeed the safety was still engaged. He had spent 2 hours in abject terror of a woman who had casually noticed that he wasn't even capable of firing his gun. By now, a crowd had gathered. The diplomatic reception had essentially ground to a halt as word spread that something interesting was finally happening. Ambassador Morrison had wandered over, looking concerned but not particularly surprised, as if his bodyguard regularly caused internationally wanted criminals to have public nervous breakdowns. Everything okay here, Tank? Jake asked, using what was apparently Rosa's nickname with the casual familiarity of someone who had clearly seen this sort of thing before. Just fine, Ambassador, Rosa replied. This gentleman was apparently planning to disrupt the peace talks, but he's decided to pursue other career opportunities instead. She looked at Vex with something that might have been sympathy. Haven't you? Vex nodded frantically. Yes, absolutely. Other career opportunities. Many other career opportunities. Accounting. I mentioned accounting, right? Very peaceful. No weapons involved, just numbers and forms, and absolutely no diplomatic incidents. Station security chose that moment to arrive, huffing and puffing from what had apparently been a frantic search of the entire station. Their leader, a Centaurian with the harried expression of someone whose job had just become much more complicated, looked around at the scene with barely concealed confusion. We received reports of an armed individual threatening diplomatic personnel, the security chief announced. Multiple witnesses reported seeing someone with a plasma rifle. Rosa pointed at Vex's discarded weapon. That would be this gentleman's rifle. He's surrendering voluntarily, very cooperative. I think he's learned a valuable lesson about career planning. The security team moved in to secure Vex, who went along with them with the docile compliance of someone whose spirit had been thoroughly and professionally broken. As they led him away, he could be heard muttering something about night classes in bookkeeping and the importance of proper work-life balance. Ambassador Morrison watched the proceedings with the air of someone who had seen his bodyguard resolve international incidents through the sheer force of being intimidating while drinking coffee. So, he said to Rosa, lunch? I heard the station's food court has that new Altarian place you wanted to try. Rosa checked her watch and nodded approvingly. Perfect timing. I worked up an appetite with all that walking around. Plus, I want to try their spicy noodle soup. I heard it's actually hot enough to be interesting. As they walked away, the crowd of diplomats slowly began to disperse, most of them making mental notes to be significantly more polite to human diplomatic missions in the future. A few of them were already drafting messages to their home governments, suggesting that humanity might be worth taking more seriously as a galactic power. After all, any species that could produce someone like Rosa Valdez and then casually assign her to babysit their most diplomatically enthusiastic representative was clearly not a species you wanted to underestimate. The Galactic Peace Summit continued for 3 more days, and by all accounts it was the most successful diplomatic gathering in recent memory. Whether this was due to Ambassador Morrison's innovative approaches to cross-cultural communication, or the fact that everyone was now absolutely terrified of accidentally annoying the humans, remained a matter of scholarly debate. Vex, meanwhile, was last seen enrolling in correspondence courses for financial planning, and asking his cellmate about the job market for reformed assassins with strong organizational skills. Word had it he was doing very well in his studies and had developed a particular talent for tax preparation. He never did find out whether Rosa had actually been tracking him through the station's sensor network, or if she really had just been taking a casual security-conscious stroll around the station. Some questions, he had decided, were better left unanswered. especially when the person who might answer them was someone who could end your career by simply existing in your general vicinity while holding a cup of coffee.